Hello and welcome to the land down under, where the beer flows free and men chunder. Your hosts Frank and Gaz will seek to wrestle the latest technology, including AI voice actors such as myself. Their goal? To take a cross-disciplinary deep dive into the Beatles' 1964 Australasian tour.
Yeah, Australia. Think of satiric economy with 4 musicians going through it. Hello, Cover. How's Wagga Wagga?
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.
Welcome back to They Came to a Land Down Under, where the beer still flows freely, albeit with more zero and mid-strength options these days. So hopefully there's less of the chunder. And a wine industry that's making great strides, following in the footsteps of those 1960s pathfinders, the giants like Sparkling Porphyry Pearl, which we believe may have been presented to the Beatles in London prior to their tour.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. Porphyry Pearl was an amazing product. It was still very popular in the early to mid-70s. I can attest to that.
In the next couple of episodes or so, we'll probably need a map of some kind, Google Maps or something digital, so we can explore the physical built environment the Beatles discovered, the places they stayed and played and partied hard into the evenings. I'll be hitting the pavements of Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane to make some connections between people and places.
Apartment, 40 Macleay Street. Now some major renovation work going on up there, right above.
Australian architect Robin Boyd. This is also around the time of the Beatles, but 1960, but his book coming to prominence in 63 as a bit of a bestseller. The idea of the Australian ugliness and critiquing the Australian aesthetic and our borrowed identity and this mismatch of sort of other influences in Australian architecture.
Not prepared to recognise where, when or what he is living, the Australian consciously and subconsciously directs his artificial environment to be uncommitted, tentative, temporary, a nondescript economic functionalist background on which he can hang the features which for the moment appeal to his wandering, restless eye. Robin Boyd, The Australian Ugliness, 1960.
I guess the Beatles are encountering a period in which we'd started by virtue of the Olympics to modernise, to start to place less value perhaps on our buildings and cultural heritage for the sake of the need to accommodate growth of business in the 60s and international business such as airlines like Pan Am that were wanting to set up here in Australia.
Go-go vacation. It's Miami at a go-go price. Low jet excursion fares, palatial oceanfront hotel. Now at reduced rates. Have yourself a go-go vacation at America's Riviera.
Hotels of note, eventually most of them demolished. In Adelaide, the South Australia Hotel. In Brisbane, what's called Lennon's Hotel. A John Lennon, I'll come back to that, but no relation. Melbourne, the Southern Cross Hotel, they're all demolished. In Sydney, the Sheraton Motor Hotel, that's now an apartment block and it's still in place, but there's nothing there to note the incredible significance of the building. I did a walk by and, all you see is a real estate agency at the front of that. In Wellington, the accommodation now is a boarding-style facility. In Auckland, the Royal International Hotel, which was a 19th century building, was demolished after the 1987 stock market crash. In Christchurch, the Clarendon Hotel, which apparently hosted the Shah of Iran at some point, well, that was unfortunately demolished after earthquakes in New Zealand in recent years. And the Dunedin City Hotel, as far as I can tell, was demolished in 1986. So a lot of this cultural Beatles heritage is no longer there.
The scene's incredible at the moment. All you can see in front of us here are...
Looking at cities like Adelaide, Brisbane and Wellington, they very much found themselves accommodated in, you might say, some of the last bastions of the colonial era or facilities that were fit for royalty and visitors of the empire.
Only 166 years ago, the first settlement was made not far from where we stand by Captain Phillip and his small band of Englishmen. In the same short space of time, we have seen the rise of Australia as a great nation.
The group stayed at the historic South Australia Hotel. Now, this was described as one of the great hotels of the British Empire, all right?
British Empire,
the entire empire.
Give way. Square city, named for a dull dead queen, bulge like the trousered bottoms of squealing 16. Sag like their sweaters, elegant old veranda of the hotel where Schnabel and Menuhin once were seen, and whispered on by black-tied and jewelled guests at dinner. We want Paul. We love George. From the marble steps and columns of Parliament House, where the gargle of politicians spat out lengthier platitudes.
Heavens only knows how many. So boys and girls, please, if you're going to cooperate, try and keep back from the crush barrier to save those in front who are suffering quite a bit at this present time, especially the young girls who are being trapped.
And it housed people like, obviously, apart from the Beatles, Anna Pavlova, great ballerina, H.G. Wells, Sir Laurence Olivier, Noel Coward, Catherine Hepburn. It assumed a major role in Australia's social life and community. It was used by American forces as their headquarters during World War II.
To many, the South, the city's 3-storey grand hotel, was Adelaide. During its last great era from 1934, when Louisa O'Brien was owner and hostess, it was renowned for superb service and cuisine. In traditional grand style, she and her family descended the stairs each evening to take their place in the dining room. Her irascible, autocratic head waiter, the Russian-born Louis Cotton, was unforgettable. Reigning supreme, he refused admittance to any male guest not wearing a tie, regardless of their social status. He retired on New Year's Eve, 1970, after 50 years' service. Patricia Summerling's South Australian Hotel, History Trust of South Australia, accessed May...
And that was bulldozed in the early 1970s. It was decided by faceless executives who lived in another city to demolish the iconic building to make way for the more modern yet strangely unspectacular Gateway Hotel. Maybe a symptom of the declining empire and the march of commerce with these faceless executives.
It's quite understandable that post-war, Australia was on this whole journey of get rid of the old and bring in the new.
Yeah, okay.
It was a new era. We had to grow. We had to populate or perish. We had to become a modern country. And so the culture of modernism...
You're an apologist for destruction of our culture.
I think I'm explaining, mate. The nature of modernism around the world hit Australia's world and took hold after the war. And I suspect that newness, something new, represented progress, expansion, leaving the hard times of, the Depression and the war and the austerity, leaving it all behind. And it went hand in hand with rapid expansion of the suburbs, rising use of cars by ordinary Australians. And who doesn't want a car?
The curtain rises on a new star, the new Holden. Fashion-setting beauty to thrill the eye. New, finer performance and surging power. There's a wonderful new look to Holden, both inside and out, with sparkling new colours in either single or two-tone, each perfectly colour-matched to the glamorous new interior styling. What a beauty she is.
These critiques that you're mentioning, some might derive them as the critiques of elites. More seriously, I think there was an emerging sense in the 60s that we were starting to trash our history by some people were starting to realise that. And, all progress, in quotation marks, has got its cost. It's got its social cost. It's got its economic cost, right? What I find interesting is one particular aspect of Australian history, which starts manifesting in the late 60s and early 70s, was when there was a backlash against the mindless, and just indiscriminate demolition of this stuff. And it came to a head with the Green Band movement of the early 70s in Sydney in particular, but it spread elsewhere through none other than the Builders Labourers Federation, which was a working class union led by Jack Mundy. He was quite famous in Sydney in the 70s and 80s. And if I just might quote from him, because he stopped a whole bunch of developers. The union stopped a whole bunch of development, particularly in the Rocks in Sydney. And the Rocks is still around because of this movement, and a whole bunch of buildings that otherwise would have been demolished were preserved. And he said, yeah, we want to build. However, we prefer to build urgently required hospitals, schools, other public utilities, high-quality flats, units and houses, provided they are designed with adequate concern for the environment, than to build ugly, unimaginative, architecturally bankrupt blocks of concrete and glass offices. So this was a working-class union leader who represented, scaffolders, builders, labourers, a whole bunch of people in the building industry that said, really, I think we've had enough.
Right. So
this was emerging out of the early 60s, and it came to a head in the 70s, and it became the whole environmental movement and the preserving our built environment is now such a big part of our discourse on how we should develop our cities.
I don't think there's yet a book on the Beatles and their relationship to these debates in Australia and our built environment, but I'm going to posit that in another tangential link that they found themselves somehow, almost at the centre, the crucible of this tension and debate as they,
at the crossroads.
At the crossroads, right?
Now on its final approach, the Fokker Friendship and Serai, now on its final approach to Melbourne Airport, should be touching down within the next 60 to 90 seconds. Further details shortly. Back to Beetle Control.
We cross now to Neil Thompson down there at the Southern Cross Hotel. A little noisy, Neil, but come on in. Oh, thank you, Don. It's mayhem down here. There are thousands upon thousands. From where I am standing here in Island's window, looking down across the road to the Southern Cross Hotel main entrance, I can see perhaps, maybe a third of the crowd. The number would be about 10,000, perhaps as many.
Yeah, making their way into Melbourne, and they're brought to the Southern Cross Hotel. So they're finding themselves at the heart of this very tension and debate. So it's opened in August 62. Our first modern, quote, international hotel, promising American-style grandeur and jet-set visitors. It's hosted the big visitors. We've had Judy Garland and Rock Hudson, John Wayne, Marlene Dietrich, Frank Sinatra. This is a place that he was hiding out in during the 74 tour when there was a massive furore.
Will Mr. Sinatra apologise?
No, there's nothing to apologise for. We regret the incident. Except no culprit.
It was a fascinating part of Australia's history.
Future Prime Minister Bob Hawke had to personally intervene to broker an intervention. We had election night parties held there. We had the Logies and the Brownlow Awards. All rooms are air-conditioned, right? Each guest can regulate the temperature to his liking. This is the promotion of the era. He can even switch it off and open the windows, which was a concession apparently to Australian tastes. Radio, TV, and the promise of, quote, piped music available in every room.
Wow.
And now for a few words from our 1964 sponsors.
Click Go the Shears, and you can win a lock of Paul's mop top. Here's the contest that no Beatle fan should miss. TV Week has the only genuine lock of Beatle hair in Australia. And girls, to make it more exciting, the hair was cut from Paul McCartney's mop top. TV Week, July 4th, 1964.
But at the time, it made its impression. Fascinating variety of eating places, 10 restaurants and bars. In the Club Grill, you could arrange a business conference over a man-sized midday meal.
Some selections from the Coolabah menu, Southern Cross Hotel, 1964. Steak and kidney pie, fried chicken Maryland Garni, hot curried eggs in tartlet with potato and vegetables Frankfurters and Boston baked beans, spaghetti marinara, half chicken Capricornia with potato salad, tomato and pineapple, curried Tasmanian lobster.
And from 3 p.m, women can share the Club Grill too, which was great. So it was obviously emerging sense of the role of women as we've been talking about.
It begs a question, and I don't know if this applies to other countries. It probably does. I'm sure it does. But what does it say about the Australian character that it can so readily be led by new and emerging international trends, and yet that just evaporates so quickly afterwards? Do you think there's something there? Is there something in the national character which predisposes us to be like that? Is there some sort of bifurcation of our mentality? On the one hand, we're very, very easily led by international trends and by authority. And on the other hand, we've got this sort of, almost irreverent FU attitude to authority. Now, does that binary come into play here? I'm not sure. What do you reckon?
I agree. I think this is the tension we were talking about in the first episode, which I called the Downunder dialectic. But
Downunder, that's correct. I remember now.
That's
yes.
it. But I think there's a manifestation of that in these tensions each way, that we seek that affirmation by, borrowing. And that's what I think Boyd, as an architect, was getting at. We ended up with a sort of confused built landscape because we weren't confident enough to forge our own style, which was in keeping with our own landscape and culture and environment.
Hiding behind a smokescreen of bourgeois cliches. Don't go messing about your tape recorder, do I?
By the 90s, it was considered to be a hotel in bad taste. Pan Am sold the interest in the hotel in 77, leaving it to Australian ownership until it was sold to the Republic of Nauru. Nauru, using their phosphate revenues and investing heavily in the Melbourne property sector. But they just got themselves another dud deal because it ended up having to be demolished because described as being concrete cancer. It was a ruined, derelict building until it was demolished in 2003.
Old Jack Mundy got it right when he called them unimaginative, architecturally bankrupt blocks of concrete and glass offices.
Across the road at the Southern Cross, the barricades have been pushed down twice. There are swarms of police in there trying to rectify the situation.
So, Frank, I mentioned the Southern Cross Hotel was demolished in 2003. It was only about a year or so later before it was replaced by the Southern Cross Towers, also known as 121 Exhibition Street. 161 metres, that's about 530 feet for those in the old scale. A skyscraper comprising 39 levels of office accommodation, and it's a twin tower. So I had to make my way down Exhibition Street to see what had replaced that icon of Beatles Australian history.
Back at this huge towering edifice. Similar features to the front of the Southern Cross Hotel, in all the glass that's down on the ground floor. Gives you a good sense of the pressure of the numbers of people in this tiny space.
In the bid to compete with our bloggers and YouTubers offshore who are having success, I did try to replicate the discovery of a tree, if you remember that our...
Oh, yes, there was a famous, from memory, it was a plane tree, wasn't it?
The London plane tree, that's right, where the photographs of the time show fans climbing that tree and getting it to a better view of the Beatles as they looked over the balcony from the Southern Cross Hotel out into that, up to 20,000 people potentially cramming that space. And if you recall, I went down to the Exhibition Street and did a bit of a search, and I wasn't able to sort of take some DNA scrapings from the tree or find an arborist, I guess it would be, wouldn't it?
It would be an arborist and maybe an archaeologist in terms of age sampling, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe some carbon dating or I don't know, isotopes.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Carbon dating. If there's still some residual DNA, you could carbon date it with the bark around the tree, or maybe use the technology which shows the amount of rings. Looking at the growth of rings.
That's right. Well, either way, I was pretty determined that you and I could produce some cultural heritage that was still remaining from this tour. And so what I decided to do was I dig a bit more deeply into this issue of the tree, because just from my casual reflection, comparing photographs to then and now shot, there was a chance that London plane tree was the tree. It was, despite Melbourne's weather and 4 seasons in a day, it could well have still been standing.
Gee, that'd be very exciting, wouldn't it?
I found this very informative, interactive website for those that are interested called Melbourne Urban Forest. You have an imagery from the top of the city, of the CBD, and you can go down, you can click and go closer, and you can go right in and click on any particular tree in the city of Melbourne. It's going to tell you something about its vintage and there's plans for replanting. And then it comes up and says you can email the tree, right? This is fantastic. So I thought, well, it's a mature tree, so it's been there a while. So I've emailed off, and weeks went by, and I thought, somebody probably just thinks this is a bit of a joke. Somebody's actually asking whether or not the tree has survived since the Beatles were there or not. Sent them the photographs of the Beatles looking from the balcony at people climbing in the tree. But such was the determination of my research, right? just popping in an email box late last week is a very kind response, a bit apologetic that it had taken this long, but very exciting news. We are able to offer something here to listeners.
Hi guys, yes, we believe that tree does still exist. Our records do not go back that far, but by comparing the aerial imagery, we do believe it's the same tree. I hope this response is not too late for your podcast. Please let me know if you have any further questions. Kind regards, the Urban Forest and Ecology Team Parks and City Greening, City of Melbourne.
We're going to need a plaque. And I don't see why there can't be a plaque. If you caught the news over the weekend or a few days ago, George Harrison's home in Liverpool now has one of the blue plaques. It's finally, like we were talking about, George has arrived, right?
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that we've had the apotheosis of George, right? He's been officially turned into a god, right?
He's a god now because he's got a blue plaque. I'm not sure that the correct recognition's been given here by the City of Melbourne.
I think, look, a shout out to my mates in Melbourne. It is the city of culture, right? It is the city that prides itself on its cafe culture, on its urbanity, on its, the most friendly place to live in Australia, most livable city.
Has once again confirmed what we already know. Melbourne is the most livable city on earth. We secured the coveted #1 ranking for the 6th year in a row.
What better thing than to recognise this added dimension to their cultural base, than to recognise the plane trees where fans clung on to watch the Beatles.
Absolutely.
I think that'd be a phenomenal addition to their cultural heritage.
And they're going to have to factor into the planting plan when it comes to, because these vintage trees have probably reached their life. So what are we going to do about them?
I'm sure there'd be a lot of creative people out there that could suggest naming that area, valorising the tree.
Do you think it should be George or Ringo? Or?
Oh, look, far be it from me to pick sides.
I've got a better idea. This is also breaking news since we've recorded that it is possible, I believe, that Jimmy Nicol has been found alive somewhere.
Really? Are you serious?
According to the author that we cited from 2013, 2014, Jim Birkenstadt, reissuing his book, there's some social media posts with a photograph, a bearded Jimmy, suggesting with a stamp, found. What could be better act of sort of reconciliation with Jimmy to potentially name a tree after him outside the Southern Cross Hotel and bring him back?
That's that's an act of inspiration there.
And you know what? It comes at the right time where there is something of a renaissance on the Jimmy Nicol story. A play opening June 22nd at the Basin Theatre, Dungala Road, the Basin, Victoria, is Jimmy the Beatle.
Really?
Written and directed by Tim Byron. It's celebrating the 60th anniversary of the tour Like Us.
Well, I think, I don't know about you, but I'm tempted to go.
Are you there? I mean, these tickets are going fast. Jimmy, best known for sitting in for Ringo Starr, obviously we know, for 8 concerts during the Beatles' 64 World Tour.
Look, this is just an ad hoc, top-of-the-head idea. They ought to shoot off a free ticket to Dave Grohl.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
It's great! Kids are jumping up and down there in all directions. At the moment now, behind me, I'm right in the middle of Flemington Road, about 500 yards up from Racecourse Road, and we can hear the sirens, we can hear the screaming and cheering inside our car. We've got the car locked at the moment, so you probably won't hear much noise. The reason we've got our car locked is because it was nearly turned over a little while ago when a great surge of kids came forward to try, and here they come now, right up behind us. And police motorcycle it was, almost drove into the car with us. The rest of them are coming up behind now. As far as I can see, there are about 4 police cars.
So I was meeting some people in the new Southern Cross Towers, and I thought I'd open the meeting on a bit of a lighter note. I asked, are you familiar with the history of this building? I've got to say, I was pretty impressed. Impressed that they said, well, yes, we believe this is where the 4 Beatles stayed. I had to correct them, though, Frank.
Oh, right.
4? No, 5. Because Jimmy Nicol, of course, the temporary drummer, was still in Melbourne as Ringo Starr arrived. So incredible point of differentiation again for Australia there. Who else has had the 5 Beatles in a hotel?
And let's face it, what a lost opportunity.
And listeners, here I am in the Qantas lounge of the airport in Darwin. I've seen a photograph of John, Paul, George and Jimmy Nicol talking to some journalists in the Qantas lounge at this airport. While the roof tiles look uncannily alike to those in the current Qantas lounge, I'm pretty sure this isn't the same place in the same building because of the terrible and tragic events of Cyclone Tracy, which destroyed most of the city and saw the airport rebuilt. In other cities, they were accommodated more in buildings that reflected glamour of the jazz age. People used to say that New York had its Waldorf Astoria, London the Savoy, and Brisbane its Lennon's. So in 1884, hotelier John Lennon built the stylish Lennon's Hotel on George Street. And as I said, no relation there, although as we find out later, John did have relatives in New Zealand. In 1972, this again was locked down, but a new site was prepared near Queen Street. The legacy is still there, although there's not a hotel called Lennon's, but what survives today is Lennon's Restaurant. And if you go to their website, they talk about many locals enjoy sharing their Lennon's stories. Because Lennon's Hotel was the place for VIPs. So Charles Kingsford Smith, Dame Nellie Melba, Robert Menzies, President Lyndon Johnson. Alexander Graham Bell, quote, the telephone inventor. They spell it out for us.
Oh, right.
He visited in 1910 on part of a global tour examining the social experiments at the time. Right. So what he was really taken was the Australia's suffrage movement and the right for women to vote. An even more important connection to a great figure in US and Australian history. If you remember a certain military figure evacuated from the Philippines.
I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
Many reported it as I will return, but according to the New York Times of April 1964, must have been around the time of his death, army sources at the Pentagon said in a check of historical records that he said, I shall return. As of 1942, MacArthur and his 300 staff moved into Lennon's Hotel as their headquarters. And on the fourth floor, all entrances were guarded, but public lounges in the hotel remained open. So there's all this, there's incredible history the Beatles are walking into, whether they were aware of that or not.
But it'd be fair to say Brisbane would, and Queensland perhaps more generally, would represent the epitome of modernism through the 60s and 70s and 80s of modernism in Australia. Development was king. The Gold Coast sprung up in a very short period of time. You have tropes like the White Shoe Brigade, right? A whole development culture.
There are plenty of tradition-loving Australians who are sickened by it, who can't mention its name without a shudder. But if you believe the local propagandists, this is the modern Australian's idea of paradise.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
Some call it Australia's Barbary Coast, and there are a few pirates there for sure. Others call it Sin City. They're living out of baccarat, dope, witchcraft, prostitution, stripping. The Cross is not a place, but a state of mind, where life comes out of an espresso machine, and you can have it any way you like it.
In Sydney, they find themselves in, I guess, a radius of 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres, probably a little bit like your musical trope earlier of the Crossroads. We're talking here about King's Cross and Potts Point.
Yes, that's correct.
And Rushcutters Bay. Yeah. There's a lot of Beatles history in there that I'm not sure that participants in the City to Surf run are fully across.
Fully au fait with. Now, you know, I'm speculating here. Well, I'm not so much speculating, but drawing inference from a range of famous clubs worldwide. I'm thinking of the United States in particular, that did attract their own colourful identities. were smack bang in the middle of the entertainment area. And were instrumental in promoting the careers of other famous artists, be it Duke Ellington, Frank Sinatra, all these very famous stars in America all had their brush, as it were, with colourful identities in nightclubs. It seems part of the rubric, the culture of entertainment in the West, probably even further than that, that these two elements come together. Now, because it is entertainment comes in many forms, right? And music's just one of them. And these forms of entertainment, I guess, attract one another. I don't know what you think about that.
The Beatles were staying at the Sheraton Motor Inn on, 40 Macleay Street, which is now kind of the more gentrified end, I guess you could say, of that route that leads up into the centre of King's Cross.
Yeah.
Right on the corner there, going back to about 1963, Surf City.
Yes, Surf City.
In a piece for the State Library of New South Wales website in 2020, Jack Ollett describes the venue as having been accused of, quote, breeding delinquents, unquote, soon after it opened in 1963. But also in its short lifetime, it was crucial to the musical industry of Australia and history. Here Australians were caught up in the surf music craze that emerged from the west coast of the United States in the early 60s, the venue hosting a wave of Australian surf bands, including the Atlantics, the Vibratones and the Nocturnes. Managed by one John Harrigan, described as a flamboyant bookie who would later have a hand in some other infamous Sydney venues, he became the manager of emerging rock star Billy Thorpe.
That suit is sharper than shark shit, my son. That was the first thing little Sammy said to me the first night we met. The year was 1963. The place King's Cross in Sydney, New South Wales. The June of 1963 King's Cross was music, musicians, poets, painters, brothels, hookers, pimps, hoons, charity moles, spruikers, toffs, chats, mooks, lairs, mugs, drag queens, strag shines, bent cops, street gangs, armed robbers, killers, neon, glitz, Surf City, the Pink Pussycat, Italian, Hungarian, Thai and Indian food, and the best bloody schnitzels on the planet. Billy Thorpe, 1996.
They're in the crosshairs of the underworld, gambling, nightclub, adult entertainment. Jimmy Nicol, who of course had the advantage of just being the fill-in drummer, so perhaps not as recognisable or got the status of the Beatles. But that said, he still got quite a bit more attention from women than he had expected. From a man who'd been unkindly compared in looks by one writer to Frankenstein without the bolt.
Yeah, that's very harsh, isn't it?
That's harsh.
And graphic. And graphic.
Nevertheless, he was of the five Beatles capable and able to get a sneaky side trip in Sydney to the suburb of Arncliffe to meet some long-lost cousins, apparently tracked down by the DJ Bob Rogers. And Glenn A. Baker records this in his book and describes him turning up to the suburbs and being questioned and drilled quite hard by an aunt. This mob you're with, they have long hair, do they? He explained that he'd used some lotion to try and accelerate the growth since being asked to join the Beatles. He shopped for souvenirs and then returned to Macleay Street, which was the location of the Sheraton Motor Inn that we've talked about. Reportedly held up by security on the return who didn't actually recognise him. So poor old Jimmy's...
Poor old Jimmy, he's suffering a bit, and the aunt who's after all just doing her job is 1964 after all.
Just making sure that he was maintaining some levels of decorum, right? From
decorum, absolutely.
What she remembered the old England to be like, because clearly she'd migrated
some years before.
Look, he made a more interesting side trip as well to a notorious nightclub called Checkers.
Saturday night, and Sydney offers the full range of entertainment of a capital city.
John Harrigan, who sets up this surf city and it really, really takes off. He takes a share in the Checkers nightclub, right? So here's a cross-town connection.
A cross-link.
Cross-link. Here's Billy Thorpe, John Harrigan. He gets into business with the Wongs to set up Whiskey A Go-Go.
And one thing that struck me when I read that was that young Billy from Brisbane, he's finally coming to the big smoke of Sydney. And he's very, very impressed by the glitter and the glamour that he's walking into. This is the sort of place it was, I guess. It was the epicentre of Australian excitement when it comes to entertainment, and he's walking right
and
into
adult
that
entertainment
space.
as well.
This is what the Beatles. Well, yes. If you want to go down that route, the point is that this was where the Beatles themselves landed, in that epicentre, that sort of cauldron.
Apparently, John Lennon hears about this young Billy Thorpe. And wants to know a little bit more about him. Now, I've tracked down the sources on that. I don't have it directly from Billy's own words, but a couple of books recount the fact that the Aztecs were backing a British musician who was also staying in the hotel at the time, Tony Sheridan, who had previously association with the Beatles. And Billy Thorpe goes to visit him, who was unwell, and then apparently gets to go along the corridor and quote, have a cup of tea with John Lennon and the Beatles.
And apparently very powerful tea, as I recall reading. If you've seen any clippings of Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs in concert, he had a commanding stage presence and really did have a driving force in the music, which really got the crowd going.
So Betty Stewart, who was on the promotion of the Beatles tour, also was closely associated with Checkers through the promotion of the acts that played at Checkers. The Wongs connected to John Harrigan and Billy Thorpe, as we've talked about, the Whiskey A Go-Go. And let's throw into this mix here some other connections to the Sydney underworld. On the death of a notorious Sydney underworld figure, Richard Gabriel Riley, which is the subject of David Hickey's book, The Prince and the Premier from 1985, shot to death by gangland rivals in June of 1967 at Double Bay. On his person was discovered a diary in which he names many, many connections in all kinds of related industries, and including the Wongs of Checkers. On my tour of sites, of course, made my way in Sydney to the location of what was the Sydney Stadium, known to many as the Old Tin Shed. It was the iconic Sydney boxing and entertainment venue, established, I believe, for the World Heavyweight Boxing title fight as far back in 1908. It was meant to be a temporary structure, but in 1912 it was roofed over and enlarged to become a more permanent structure, albeit of wood and galvanised iron, affectionately known as the Old Tin Shed. And it probably didn't get too much of an upgrade since about 1912. It's become iconic. There's a plaque there noting the significance of this stadium.
On my left, some brick walls, what seems to be a school bus waiting to collect the cricket team of the Sydney Grammar School. Many would have walked this footpath and not realised the plaque now built in the ground, which recognises this as the location of what was colloquially known as the Old Tin Shed, the Sydney Stadium. You can notice the inscription on the ground from the Wallara Municipal Council, the Beatles concerts at the Sydney Stadium, June 18 to 20, 1964, celebrating our history.
Working in this plant have come to Australia from Europe to settle with their families in the garden town of Elizabeth.
But they played host to like Louis Armstrong, Frank Sinatra, Buddy Holly, the Rolling Stones, but terrible, terrible sound. And George Harrison hated it and wrote home about that.
Dear Mum and Dad, we played at the stadium here in Sydney and it was the biggest drag of all time. The stage revolves every 3 minutes and we have to walk down the aisle like the boxers to get on the stage. I punched a policeman because he was shoving me like mad, and some kids had hold of me all at once as I was trying to get off the stage. It was awful, and the police haven't had it before,
Became
so
a bit
they
of a
panicked.
sore point for other touring artists. So you had probably less family-friendly visitors coming several years later in the name of the Small Faces and the Who. They didn't get the same welcoming treatment the Beatles got. They described the welcome of landing in Australia and being sprayed by quarantine officials in the face. They had a very bad early press conference where someone sort of asked them about, well, what drugs are you on? Ian McLagan, who was a member of the Small Faces and the Faces, first gig in Sydney was an echoing corrugated iron shed that had a manually operated revolving stage. And I don't mean someone manually pushing a button. This thing was pushed around by a number of beefy geezers while we were playing. Unfortunately for us, whenever they felt like it or got tired, they'd leave it in one place. It was a little spasmodic. They'd start pushing in the middle of a song just when you'd found some little darling to look at in the audience. Steve Marriott, the lead singer, got pissed off at the guys, so they just left it in one spot, which pissed him off even more. The audience soon picked up on his anger and began squirming in their seats. I was glad when it was all over, and of course the next day the press slagged us off rotten, referring to us as bad-tempered louts.
Well, again, there's an Aussie character. Those workers weren't going to be pushed around by these pretentious poms, were they? They were going to do it to their own time.
Absolutely.
I mean, who are these? Yeah, who are these wankers from overseas anyway?
Did you notice the boyfriend of Taylor Swift? Did you see any of the coverage on ABC 24 that morning on his arrival into Sydney?
I recall the dramatic scenes of him coming off the plane.
We saw the jet. We spotted her at a trendy pasta bar in swanky Surrey Hills, suburb of Sydney.
Yep.
Importantly, not one, but I believe two visits to
Taronga Zoo.
Down Under, the famous pair were spotted hand in hand on a date at the Sydney Zoo, just the two of them, right? Local news reports, yes, they go crazy for Swelsey there as well, saying they enjoyed seeing the koalas.
One thing that when George Harrison got very frustrated with being cooped up in the hotel rooms was to, at least in every city, try and have access to an MG. So in Melbourne, they managed to sneak out and drive through the eastern suburbs, Box Hill, Blackburn, Mitcham and Ringwood, and they ended up in the Mount Dandenong Tourist Road to Olinda, stopping at the Kenlock Tea Rooms for a sandwich. We now have some articles from June 2014 of the restaurateur Kathleen Martin telling her story, and the daughter of Kathleen telling the story on 3AW Breakfast one morning, and how George didn't want anything off the menu, he just wanted steak and chips. He was intrigued by the historical property and wanted the gardens, filming with the camera as he went. John Lennon manages to get down to the bowling alley in Rushcutters Bay, which sadly is no longer there, Frank.
No, it's not.
But it used to be in the old Travelodge building. Betty Stewart on the promotion team says she managed to ring the manager, Keith Barnes. He agreed to keep the alley opening after closing time. They went there at about midnight, and she looked on and John played a game of bowls. And she commented that this was the price to pay for this fame, was this lonely existence.
Beatles.
Fact check.
In breaking news and a demonstration of the ever-evolving historiography of the Beatles, we've been informed that John did not go to Rushcutter bowls. The true identity of the Beatle bowler, as well as the answers to other critical, enduring mysteries of the tour, will be the subject of a new book on the tour, When We Was Fab.
I mean, you've painted a very sad picture, actually, Gaz, of this poor, young rock star all alone in the epicentre of Sydney Vice, and all he can do is play bowls. I mean, really? He's not gambling with the Wongs, is he? But he is doing bowling. Now, that's a really interesting picture of the lad, isn't it? Right?
This was the largest in the Southern Hemisphere and the second largest bowling alley outside the US. I also read that at the Sydney Stadium a decade earlier, there was a huge roller derby craze. The American game on the roller skates, right?
There's Australia picking up the cultural influence.
Are we in a transition here where, by virtue of maybe Americans stationed in Australia in the Second World War, and of course they came back, during the mid-60s as well through Vietnam, but are we starting to see here the kind of signs of American culture taking over the traditional British hold there?
Well, Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, bowling was a very American activity. The fact that it was considered, as you say, the second largest after America, that's quite extraordinary. I guess as American culture was starting to really permeate Australia at the time. This is a pretty good example, I suspect.
But I also believe if you look at the television content too,
yes.
This might have been before we had any sort of local content restrictions. I believe it was sort of the programs from the 50s and I Love Lucy and things like that that constitute a lot of airtime. But that might be a bit early in your recollections, other than, of course, the black and white minstrel show that we talked about.
It's an extraordinarily important part of identity in Australia that kids like myself, whether or not I watched British stuff or American stuff, what did I care? I was a migrant. And overwhelmingly, it was American. The earliest shows I recall on black and white TV in the late 60s were things like F Troop, the Cisco Kid, Cowboys and Indians, the cartoons, which were American. And so as far as I was concerned, the world out there was
Gilligan's
American.
Island.
Gilligan's Island, another classic.
Would that have been the 60s?
Oh, definitely. Definitely the 60s and into the 70s.
You hear so distinctly the American accent in the disc jockey format. Here you have on the commercial radio stations covering the Beatles tour such an American style approach and advertising and accent. And over here on the other side, you've got the ABC and their kind of staid, still conservative British tone. It's such a
contrast. And at when I was growing up, the ABC was the standard, just because it was one of the few stations we could pick up geographically where we were located for technical reasons. But so we watched the ABC a fair bit, and we'd religiously watch the 7 o'clock news, and the announcers were very formal and British sounding, but still with an Australian edge now by the early 70s.
So, Frank, the head of the security detail for the Beatles tour, Devon Minchin, who we'll talk about in further detail in coming episodes, he hatched a successful plan to get a couple of the Beatles out to the Gold Coast hinterland, Paul in one MG and George in another. And they got to a place called Mount Tambourine, but not spelt tambourine as per the instrument. And sadly, in recent news, there have been some fires there over the summer. The primary source for this story is an article from the Tambourine Mountain News of December 2017. Peter Newbury penned an article about his day with the Beatles. He was 21 at the time in 1963. Imagine this, right? He managed to purchase an MGB Roadster. The British Motor Corporation, which was the big dealership at the time, only had one model available, right? So this Peter Newbury had just bought this brand new Roadster, and to his surprise, the British Motor Corporation approached him and asked him would he be prepared to lend his new car to this amazing new pop group, the Beatles, when they visited Brisbane. And you're thinking, what would you do?
Oh yeah, sure. Take the car and trash it, no problem. Yeah.
So there were so few of these vehicles in Brisbane, they only had access to his and one car as floor stock on the dealer's showroom. He gave in on the condition that he would accompany them, and at no time would the car be out of his control.
Very wise.
So here's this great secret operation going into plan, and Devon, with his military history and so on, perfectly well suited to this subterfuge, smuggling the Beatles out of the back of the old Lennon's Hotel in George Street, Brisbane, under a blanket, in the backseat of a Humber Super Snipe. And when young Peter Newbury asked the chief security person, I guess, assuming that's Devon, as to the need for all the guards that were involved in this, the answer was, well, his job is a much bigger deal than guarding Robert Menzies.
Well,
the Australian Prime Minister at the time.
How about that? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The full story of this is available also on some YouTube videos where you can see that they managed to reach the top of the mountain. They stopped in the rainforest at Curtis Falls. They walked in the native fauna, as we know, that attraction that Australia offers. Turned up at the Eagle Heights pub, and Paul and George this year, they were keen to shout the dealer and the security guys for a drink and have some lunch. Sorry guys, bar's closed. However, the woman behind the bar, having realised who they were, quickly turned the sign around and said, "Bar's open," and put on lunch for them. Paul played some piano, apparently composed a song there for the hostess.
How lovely.
How lovely is that,
right?
It's
very touching, very touching.
Hundreds of people had assembled on the grass around the large roundabout entrance to this hotel. Not a sound, all silent. There were troops from the Canungra Jungle Training Camp, all the nuns and children from an orphanage, children from the local schools and their teachers, all perfectly quiet and guided by the nuns. They at once broke out and sang a few of the most popular Beatles songs. This, I can honestly say, brought tears to the eyes of both Paul and George. And when the singing stopped, the pair went over to the assembled crowd, thanked the nuns and mingled and signed autographs without any fuss.
Hang on. It is quite extraordinary. So what you're telling me is that they were ushered away to a reasonably remote spot. They check out the local flora and fauna, go into a pub which is about to be shut, and opens on their behalf. And as they're there, a crowd assembles. So the word has gotten out that the Beatles are in town, or some of the Beatles, and the crowd spontaneously turns up and starts singing Beatles songs. Oh, that's quite moving because, you know, the old saying, the Lord moves in mysterious ways. I mean, these nuns may have had some sort of, inside knowledge somehow, some sort of premonition, right?
John knew that he was bigger than Jesus, but as we know later. But Devon Minchin, I managed to get a copy of his self-published biography, kindly shared by his son, former Federal Minister Nick Minchin. Thank you, Nick. He corroborates his story. He said a fellow called Keith Halliday himself smuggled Paul and George out of the hotel. Paul drove within speed limits and talked freely. George's car led them to the deserted restaurant under cliff edge in the hinterland. Delighted patron turned on lunch. He reports being accosted by a local priest. Could he have a snap for the church monthly? They then set off back to Brisbane, and strangely enough, a photo appeared in the afternoon papers. I'm not sure if the Lord has intervened there or not, but...
Well, how do four boys from Liverpool become so enormous? The one theory is that it was just divine intervention.
Both Devon and Peter in their accounts of this make no mention of visiting Broadbeach on the Gold Coast. And I mention that because some other videos and YouTube videos and articles have suggested that they did go to Broadbeach. But strangely enough, two separate accounts don't make mention of this at all. There are some other enduring mysteries, though, associated with the tour. In particular, Jimmy Nicol, on the last night, knowing that he's going to be going back to London, makes a run for it. Drives off at speed to a seaside part of Melbourne, settles in for a drink, only to be chased down by members of the Beatles entourage and dragged back. Glenn A. Baker mentions Beaumaris, but I'm unable to corroborate that. I'm unable to find any other source to suggest where he ended up.
Morning, Jimmy Nicol leaves Melbourne for Sydney and then direct to London and will not, as previously announced, stay over to perform with Francis.
Creating a portrait, a very detailed portrait of what they were up to in those two places, and we do need the local aficionados to come in with and assist.
We need some wire diagrams here. We need maps. We need to work this out. There was apparently in Melbourne a side event or party in what's been described as a swanky eastern suburb. Toorak is suggested. I've read years later on a blog a fellow by the name of Gary Spry. He was the manager of a band called The Flies, which was very popular in Melbourne at the time, and owner of the Pinocchio's music club in Toorak Road. And according to him in the Beatles Bible, he says, I held a party for the Beatles in Toorak for 60 people on their day off from 8 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Then we went back to the floor at the Southern Cross Hotel until 2 a.m. Independently, though, to show the Beatles' connection spread, the tentacles spread further out into suburban Melbourne. Now, the Beatles are a draw card, I know, on many fronts, but I didn't know that they were also a fantastic point of differentiation for property. So here we have an article in a real estate website from 2021. It says, money can't buy love, but it can buy you a stately South Melbourne terrace where the Beatles once died.
That would be gold, wouldn't it? I mean, you could absolutely. You could flip that and make an absolute fortune in today's market, in particular. But I just an observation on them on the party thrown at Toorak, which ended at the respectable hour of 10:30, and then they went on to some place to Back to the hotel, and they stayed up until, what did you say, 2 a.m.? Well, I think if that can be corroborated, I think that's momentous historical evidence that something stayed open in Melbourne at the time, past about 10:30. So that would be an important social marker, I think, if someone could corroborate that.
This property turns out to be that of the music promoter Ken Brodziak, who we've been talking about.
Yeah, right.
Right. So it's on the market in 2021 for the first time in 20 years. They're asking 5.4 to 5.6 million. According to historical newspaper records, which I haven't been able to verify, Mr. Brodziak was said to have entertained the band at the Grand property in 1964. The real estate agents really work in this, right?
And an extraordinarily deep block, the overall land size is unusual for the area. The Beatles were there back in 1964, and it's just a stunning home with big proportions.
Yeah, man, that real estate agent is earning his or her money, right? Actually, sweating the asset, right?
Adelaideans may know that Centennial Hall in the showgrounds was recently demolished. Well, Adelaide and Rural Salvage in Wingfield have got a hold of the Jarrah floorboards. It's 75mm tongue and groove secret nail profile and is in pretty good condition. I bought a 600 linear metre pack of the stuff off them for $2,400. Apparently they have a couple of thousand squares left. If you like the idea of playing with timber that the Beatles and Rolling Stones performed on, this is for you.
Another part of our Beatlemania Day at 3UZ.
We're going to go over the ditch here. John managed a couple of meetings in New Zealand. Now, I alluded to this earlier, that it turns out that he had relatives who were living outside Wellington on a farm. And I don't know if I'd told you about this so far, Frank, but Aunt Mimi, who had raised John, went on this tour partly to Australia and then went off to New Zealand to stay with the cousins. And Aunt Mimi had suggested that they all ought to meet their cousin John. So the Parker family piled into their Holden station wagon that morning after milking the cows and arrived at St George Hotel, where the Fab Four were staying on the 3rd floor.
The St George Hotel is just a sea of faces. Doreen, how many people would you estimate are down there?
Oh, Peter, thousands.
In fact, we enjoyed most of the place. I wasn't too keen on New Zealand, I must admit, but most of Australia was nice. I think Adelaide I liked most of all. Would you like to come back?
Well, that's very heartwarming, isn't it? I mean, family connections at the other side of the world, and not unusual for people from Liverpool, migrants from Liverpool, and there you have the Fab Four coming and visiting. That's fascinating.
To have that strong connection. One of the children was just 12 and recounts this. He says, of course he knew who John Lennon was, but if he was honest, he was more interested in rugby and cricket than pop music at that age. Ringo didn't get out as much. He didn't go to the hinterland of the Gold Coast. But strangely enough, rumours were circulating of some Ringo sighting. Nearby in Queensland, Grantchester. The story turns up, I believe, in the 2010s when Ringo was about to visit Australia again with the All-Star Band. The kind residents of Grantchester have extended a special invitation to the megastar. National Trust volunteers who maintain the historic Grantchester station have invited him to pay a visit after learning of a local myth that Ringo secretly visited the station in June 1964. Ringo was, of course, the voice for Thomas the Tank Engine.
Oh, well, look at that. I have a grandson who's a huge fan of Thomas the Tank Engine, as are an army of 3 to 7 year olds, I suppose, around the world, and legendary legacy in Thomas the Tank Engine. That's incredible, isn't it?
This rumour, this legend had it that he dropped by the Grantchester station, the first station in Queensland, I might add, while George and Paul were off at Mount Tambourine. Their ancestors of the station said they didn't recall the visit.
That's a bit right. Well, they might have been getting on by that stage.
Kathy Gillam from the Grantchester Model Life Team Train Association. Rowley's been here since 1936 and he doesn't remember it. If he did visit, it must have been very quiet. Frank Klein, who was the Grantchester station master in the 60s, said it's a popular myth. Part of the confusion was that there was a porter nicknamed Ringo. Final one on the side trip here. George, the New Zealand Herald, among other papers, reports that George managed a hush-hush foray out of his hotel confinement to reunite with a family of Liverpudlians who had emigrated to New Zealand in 1961. As one of the members of the family says, her parents, Jim and Josie Hughes, lived at 102 Little Heaths Road, Liverpool. The Harrison family lived at 25 Upton Green. Their homes were identical. They were corporation houses. Her mother was very good friends with George's mother, Lou, and they were often in and out of each other's homes for cuppers and chats. George and his brother Peter would come to see my father as he was an electrician. My dad would help fix an electric guitar. I remember that George and Peter babysat us once. About midnight, a Mini drew up to their house in Mount Albert. The driver dropped off George and a big security guard. George goes in and they had poached eggs on toast with tomato sauce.
Yeah.
There was a lot of catching up on news from home. At one point, Noel, who was a panel beater, and George were comparing the cost of panel beating between the two countries. George's brother Peter was a panel beater. So at 3:30 a.m, when he was ready to get back to the hotel, we set out in Noel's Holden, Noel driving me in the middle, George in the front passenger seat, and Ray in the back with the security guard. Got him back to the hotel at 4 a.m. You know, it's a lovely little story, isn't it? This sort of their desire to be normal, their desire to reconnect with the power of the ordinary connections of a family that they...
I mean, you describe it as desire. I think it's just the natural instinct of these guys. They're pretty young. They're a long way from home. Family, I mean, you talked about the working class influence. The basic culture is one of family and connection and stories which bind people together. And these stories paint an amazing picture of these guys. And I think there's a link there to the reception they got. And I know we've mentioned this in the past, but the reception they got in Adelaide, which was extraordinary, where there's a lot of Lilliputians, Liverpool people, the word, The notion that one of theirs had become famous and had come to their place, their town, would have really, really resonated. That working class culture ethos, I think, was quite a factor in that sort of reception. They're just treating him as one of the family, and he's having his eggs and tomato sauce.
And the Holden.
He's not having the canapes and the champagne. I'd love to know what model Holden been in New Zealand. It would have been, would have been a bench seat at the front, and he may have been in the middle.
But that would have been, probably bunching up and keeping warm.
Yeah, because the heater would have taken about an hour to crank up. Another point that strikes me is that the very fact that these stories are around shows how much less sophisticated the machinery around them was. When you compare them to an equivalent group now, you just would not get this sort of information and this sort of story. Even if it happened, it would be manufactured. It would go through 10 million lenses, through the communications advisor of whoever's on the entourage, and you just wouldn't get it at all. But the fact that back in 1964 they went to New Zealand and they met up with family and had eggs with tomato sauce, and the fact that we know it is an amazing thing, I think.
But over in Adelaide, it's a very different story where, as I mentioned in previous episode, the sort of power brokers of the city had really wanted to put on something very fancy and some special hospitality. And Glenn A. Baker reports about this, that there was a party that was planned for weeks in the Adelaide Hills somewhere. Here we had a Viennese chef for weeks planning the food, even making Beatles-shaped canapes, as you say, Frank. They're a no-show. We have a little bit of an insight into some of the characters we were talking about on the front page of the Adelaide Advertiser at the time. Is a photograph of John at the mayor's function. And there's a photograph saying, John meeting Mrs. Kim Benythan, K-Y-M Benythan. Now, this says something of the era, but so Mrs. Kim Benythan was Julie McClure, who was Miss South Australia of 1956 and a figure in the town, right?
An identity.
But in the photograph of the newspaper, she's described as being Mrs. Kim Benythan, the era when the husband's name was described in place of the wife's for formal pictures and articles, right?
You sound very surprised, Gaz, about this, but I think this was the norm until not too long ago, actually. Yes, this is a common trope. But what strikes me about that story in Adelaide is you get the impression that these guys, were basically utterly unimpressed or couldn't really care about the things that the Lord Mayor were desperate to impress them with, which was how important and sophisticated they were. And these four guys would much rather be eating steak and chips. They showed their preference, the old revealed preference of this by either snubbing them or not being that interested in these facts. Whereas And New Zealand, off they go in the car and meet the Rellos and have the steak and chips.
The feeling is that although they have been asked to attend the Flemington races and Australian rules football today, the Beatles again will not emerge from their hotel.
Yeah, Australia. Think of satiric colony with 4 musicians going to it. Hello, cover. How's Wagga Wagga?
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.